So the creative and cultural industries are industries which either have a high degree of creativity behind them or which are richly and deeply cultural. So it includes industries such as arts and design and music, but also industries like advertising and architecture. I think they're important for three reasons. One is because they are expressions of our humanity, our ability to create our environment and to define beautiful things. They're also important because they're growing more rapidly than the economy as a whole. So more and more people are getting jobs in these sectors and it's becoming more important. So it's important that we understand what these industries are and how they operate. Thirdly, they're important because in Europe is a composition of very different countries with very different forms of cultural expression. So this richness is a basis which is considered that Europe can exploit for its own competitive advantage, and therefore it's an area in which Europe can think to build its economy into the future. So traditionally, the creative and cultural industries have been defined by starting out by thinking about what activities are creative and cultural in the form of expression. So things like dance and art is central to the conceptualization of these industries. So we start by thinking about those things, and then we think about the activities which support those things. So things like filmmaking, things like theatres, things like publishing, things like museums and libraries all support, and then you go further out. But one of the problems with this conceptualization, although interesting, is it's difficult to operationalize. So again, the way in which these industries have been operationalized is to sort of identify a list of activities which appear to be creative or cultural. So things like advertising, design, architecture are all industries which are well defined. Some industries are less well defined. Things like crafts, they're harder to identify, but nonetheless are still there on the list. I think one of the most interesting developments recently about how to identify the creative and cultural industries has been done by the National Endowment of Science and Technology of the Arts in London, Nesta. And what Nesta did was very interesting in that they identified occupations, so what work people do, and identified those occupations which are particularly creative. And then having identified these occupations, what they did was they calculated the share of creative occupations in any industries, and then taking the industries in which a relatively high proportion of people who are in creative work were found, they used that to define the creative and cultural industries. So it's a more rigorous approach to identifying these industries. It was only done on the basis of the UK, and it may differ in different countries around the world. For example, it may differ in different countries in Europe, but it was a very interesting conceptual basis on which to identify the creative and cultural industries. Moreover, this approach has been taken up by the UK government and is now endorsed as their official approach to identifying the creative and cultural industries. So there are several controversies around the identification of the creative and cultural industries. One is the extent to which they're creative, and the other is the extent to which they're cultural, or both. So, for example, some activities are obviously both creative and cultural. Think of the classic activities like arts and music. But other activities tend to be cultural, but it's questionable whether they're creative. So for example, museums are cultural in that they're intended to uphold the cultural heritage of a country, but it's not very clear that they're very creative. Now, sometimes they can be creative in the ways in which they present their objects and artifacts, but it's not really fundamentally their game to be creative. There's other controversies around what to include and what not to include. So a funny one perhaps is that in Italy, food and food making, so restaurants and food making, is considered to be a cultural industry and therefore should be included. Whereas in Northern Europe, in Britain, which is perhaps not surprising, but also Germany, the food making is not considered to be a cultural industry. So you get some differences in the mindset about what is and is not a creative and cultural industry. Another interesting controversy is the extent to which scientists and engineers are considered to be creative or not. So actually in the definitions, neither scientists nor engineers are included in the definition of creative activities, which would underpin creative and cultural industries. And probably the real reason for this is there's an intention to separate scientific and technological creativity from creativity in expression and expressive arts. So traditionally there's been this divide between two forms of creativity, one scientific and one artistic. But I suppose the really interesting thing is that when you think of some modern industries, they actually combine both forms of creativity. So think about video games. Video games include creativity around expression, so characters in the game and how the game is engaging to play, but also creativity in terms of the functionality of the game, the technologies behind the game. So perhaps the real kind of crux, if you like, of creative and cultural activities is the bringing together of these two forms of creativity. But that is a controversial perspective. So some of the challenges of identifying the creative and cultural industries are conceptual, and I've touched on those just now. But other challenges are around identifying activities and content empirically. So think, for example, about lights and lighting industry. According to official statistics, all manufacturing of lights is classified under one code, and fundamentally it considers lighting to be functional. Lights are classified as being things which make light. But when we think about it, when we go and buy a light, how often are we just buying something which makes light? So you might go to the store, for example, and be looking for a gift. And you might be looking for a gift and you might find a light that you might like to buy, and you might think of an alternative gift which might be a vase. So in some senses the light in this case is competing not against other lights, but it's competing against a vase. So in this sense the two things are really competing not so much on their functionality, although both things have functionality, they're competing on their creative and cultural content, their design, if you like. So one of the really interesting challenges for the future will be to try to incorporate information about the value and content of design, which has its basis in creativity, into products. So how can we differentiate products in terms of their design content? Similar thing around cars, for example. Many products. You think about a category of products and you can start to see how they're differentiated in terms of some of their content, which is not just functional, and then how that content may compete with other things which are not necessarily direct substitutes. So that's one of the challenges of identifying the creative and cultural industries and activities. So you can find out more about the Creative EU project by visiting our website, which contains lots of information about our activities, who's involved in the project and what we're investigating. It also contains some of our working papers, which we are posting as we produce them. But if you want to know more about our project, please contact us by email. Our email addresses are on the website, and we'd be very happy to hear from you and hear about your interest in these activities. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for your interest in our project.